Welcome back to another video for IB Environmental Systems and Societies. Today's topic is 2.2 Communities and Ecosystems. Before we get too far into this, we need to start off with a couple of quick definitions. In our previous topic 2.1, we defined species and populations. Species, of course, refers to an individual organism. A population is a group of those organisms of the same species. A community is a group of populations. So here in this image, you can see in the front, we have all of these gazelles. That's a population of gazelles. And behind them and behind the waterhole, you have a group of zebras. The zebras are all the same species, so that's a population of zebras. The gazelles and the zebras interacting with the elephants, those are different species, so those are different populations, and they're interacting with one another. Those are a community. We also have all of these organisms interacting with populations of these different shrub and tree species. So we have plant communities and animal communities in this picture. Altogether, those communities of living organisms interacting with the physical environment that they occupy is how we define an ecosystem. And so here you can see in the ecosystem, we have the physical environment, the soil matrix with all of its mineral matter. We also have a range of different organisms, both plant and animal, interacting with one another. So this is an ecosystem in which communities of organisms interact with one another and with the physical environment. One of the big ideas in ecology is that photosynthesis and respiration dictate how energy moves through ecosystems and communities. I want to remind you that energy enters, flows through, and leaves systems, while matter and nutrients cycle repeatedly within systems. And we can see that here in this simplified diagram of the carbon cycle. We're here in our chloroplast. Process of photosynthesis is driven by the input of light energy to produce oxygen and glucose. And then in the animal mitochondrion shown here, the process of respiration splits apart the glucose and the oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water. And as it does so, it releases chemical energy from the chemical bonds that exist here in the glucose. So energy enters, energy leaves. But the oxygen, the hydrogen, and the carbon, the matter simply cycles over and over and over again. Right? You can look at any diagram of photosynthesis and respiration because this is a system, right? You should be able to identify the inputs and outputs into the process of photosynthesis, the inputs and outputs of respiration, the storages within photosynthesis, the storages within respiration, and what are the transformations or changes of energy and changes of matter within both of those processes. Right? This is photosynthesis and respiration is probably one of the only chemical reactions you should simply memorize for ESS. So recognize the chemical formula for glucose, C6H12O6. Oxygen gas is diatomic. That means it's made of two oxygen atoms. That's O2. And of course, water is H2O and carbon dioxide is CO2. You should be able to put those together. During respiration, energy is dissipated. That means it becomes spread out, more disorganized. That is entropy. There you go. We're back to our laws of thermodynamics again, right? So the process of photosynthesis organizes energy, makes it more organized by assembling it into the chemical bonds in glucose. And the process of respiration releases that energy as heat and as ATP. And so it disperses or dissipates that energy, makes it more disorganized. And this heat energy, of course, is always lost. That is why less and less energy is available at the higher and higher trophic levels we have in any ecosystem. ESS is not like DP Bio. You don't need to know all of the molecular details of the process of photosynthesis, right? So you don't need to memorize the Calvin cycle. You don't need to identify the light reactions and the dark reactions. I've never seen that on an ESS exam. Right? What you do need to know is this chemical equation. Just memorize it. It's pretty simple. This direction, carbon dioxide and water, add sunlight to produce glucose and oxygen, shows photosynthesis. The reverse of that reaction is respiration. You can literally just write it backwards. Okay. Biomass, living matter. The raw material for that primarily comes from glucose. And you can see this little hexane ring here, this purple one. It's a 6-sided ring. At every apis here, you have a carbon atom that makes 4 bonds. That's glucose. You might also have some fructose or some galactose, which are different forms of monosaccharides. Mono meaning one, saccharide meaning sugar. So these are all single sugar or simple sugar molecules. Glucose and fructose can combine to form sucrose, which is a disaccharide. It's a slightly more complex sugar, and so is lactose, right, where we have this galactose and the glucose together. You don't necessarily, for ESS, need to know the structures of all of these. It would be useful to understand that glucose, fructose, and galactose are monosaccharides, while sucrose and lactose are disaccharides, right? Di meaning 2 sugars, and that all of these little glucose units can be linked together in very long chains called polysaccharides. Poly meaning many, and saccharides meaning sugars. So you have 1 sugar, simple sugars, 2 sugars, your disaccharides, and your many saccharides or your polysaccharides. These molecules, like glycogen, become much more complex and store larger amounts of energy for longer periods of time. The next big idea in topic 2.2 is that the feeding relationships in an ecosystem are modeled using ecological pyramids. We've talked a little bit about food chains and food webs, but ecological pyramids is something that you'll see in 3 different forms in this course, right? So here we have our light energy entering the system. The primary producers convert some portion of it to biomass, living matter. And so we can measure that matter in kilocalories, and we measure it in a unit of area per square meter, and we measure it in a unit of time, in annual growth, because every year light is falling on an ecosystem, and the primary producers in that ecosystem are capturing it and using it to build their biomass. They're making their living matter out of that glucose that they produce through the process of photosynthesis. Of course, some of that biomass then decomposes, right? Leaves and twigs fall off plants. Right? Those producers lose some of the energy through heat, through the process of respiration, as we saw in previous slides. And that means that only some portion of what they produced every year is available to the primary consumers, the organisms that eat the producers. So the next layer of the ecological pyramid is a little bit narrower because it doesn't have as much energy available or as much biomass available. Same thing with the secondary consumers. They consume and convert some portion of the energy from the primary consumers that they eat. Because they are respiring, they lose some of the energy as heat. Of course, some of them also die or they excrete nutrients, and some of that energy is passed on to decomposers, which means less of that energy is available to the next trophic level, and the same process repeats all the way up to your apex predators. If you'll notice the numbers here, 20,000, 2,000, 200 kilocalories, 20 kilocalories, 2 kilocals per square meter per year. Each time you advance up a trophic level, you're generally going to go down by a factor of 10. That's the 10% rule. It's a good general guideline for figuring out how much biomass would be available at any trophic level in a given ecosystem. The amount of biomass fixed by your primary consumers may be considered 100%. Only 10% of that is available to the primary consumers, and 10% of 10% is 1%. And so by the time you get to the apex predators, it's a tiny proportion of the energy that was generated or produced by the base of the food chain or the food web. Producers called autotrophs. That's a really good scientific word to keep in your vocabulary. Self-feeders, right? These are typically plants or algae. They make their own food, right? There are some exceptions in the deep ocean where we have the chemosynthetic organisms. They generally use the heat from Earth's core that's escaping through the mid-ocean ridges or volcanoes as their primary source of energy. Right? It's always a same 4-step process, right? First, energy enters the system. The energy is absorbed by the producers. It's converted to sugars. And then at that point, it's passed on through the different trophic levels through the various consumers. You should be able to use the words producers, consumers, decomposers, ecological pyramids. This graphic is a really simple design. It shows a food chain. It's a single series of feeding relationships. This graphic here on the right is much more representative of what actually happens in ecosystems. That is a food web. Notice it's much more complex. It shows alternative feeding pathways, which brings us back to that concept of resiliency that we looked at in topic 1. Feeding relationships dictated by that 10% rule. Remember the 10% rule. It will be very useful on your exam if you're asked to make some calculations. There are 3 different kinds of ecological pyramids that you need to know about in ESS. The first is the pyramid of numbers. And in this graphic, that is this middle one right here. It's simply how many organisms there are at each trophic level within the ecosystem. It's the simplest ecological pyramid because all you've got to do is count the organisms. The second type of ecological pyramid is a pyramid of biomass. And you can see that here on the top. It shows the amount of dry biological matter or biomass per unit area. The third type of ecological pyramid that you need to know, and I would say the most important one or the most significant one, is the pyramid of productivity. And because it's about productivity, it's about the amount of biomass or energy produced per unit area per year. So if we look at ecological pyramids of numbers, biomass, and productivity, first we get the number of individuals. We can figure out what the average biomass is for each individual to determine the pyramid of biomass. And then we look at how those organisms grow over the course of the year to calculate or estimate the productivity in a particular ecosystem over an annual basis. Once again, you'll notice this pyramid shape keeps coming back. It is dictated by the second law of thermodynamics. It wouldn't surprise me if your ESS exam asks you to explain the role of the second law of thermodynamics in the flow of energy within ecosystems. That law is what dictates this 10% rule that you see right here. That law dictates this pyramid structure that's really typical for ecosystems. Back in topic 1.5, when we were talking about pollution, we came across these 2 concepts. So now we're going to go into them in a little bit more detail because bioaccumulation and biomagnification, the process is actually dictated by this movement of energy and matter through the different trophic levels in an ecosystem. Right? Recall that bioaccumulation, the buildup, accumulation of a pollutant within a single organism. That's why it's called bioaccumulation, right? So every time this organism eats a source of food that is contaminated, its body absorbs or accumulates a little bit more of the pollutant. So over time, the concentration of the pollutant builds up within that individual organism. All right. So bioaccumulation is the buildup of a pollutant over time within a single organism. Biomagnification, on the other hand, happens between trophic levels. Bioaccumulation is within a single individual over time, but biomagnification happens as you move up from your producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and apex predators within any given ecosystem. The same way that the energy decreases by 10% at each trophic level, generally speaking, your contaminant levels are going to increase by about a factor of 10 for the exact same reason. You can see that in this slide right here about DDT. So that at each level, the concentration from where DDT originally entered the ecosystem, right, was very, very, very few parts per million. And if you look at the numbers here, it goes from 0.000003 to 0.04 in the producers, the phytoplankton, to 0.20 parts per million in the zooplankton, to 2 parts per million in the small fish, to 20 parts per million in your top end predators. This approximates that 10% rule that we saw in the loss of energy between trophic levels, but in reverse. It increases or it magnifies the concentration of the pollutant. That's why it's called biomagnification. It makes it bigger. Coming back to these pyramid structures in ecosystems, right? Pyramid numbers, relatively straightforward: 10,000 shrimp, 1,000 bleak, 100 perch, 10 pike, and 1 osprey. We've simply counted the organisms. But sometimes they have different shapes because you might have a single producer, like one tree, that can support many types of herbivores and parasites. Right? And then the parasites might also have parasites of the parasites. Those are called hyperparasites. So it's possible to have an inverted pyramid or to have a spindle-shaped pyramid of numbers. Generally speaking, your pyramid of biomass is going to be pyramidal shaped, right? Again, because you've got the 10% rule, right? Sometimes they're not a pyramid shape. You might have some odd shapes like this. That's generally due to seasonal variations, particularly if you live in a part of the world where there's a dormant season. Maybe it's the winter in the polar latitudes or the temperate latitudes, or maybe it's a dry season in tropical zones. You may have times of the year when your producers go dormant, right? And so the amount of biomass that is visible or countable at that time of year might change. Pyramids of productivity. This is different from the other two because it's related to time. If you see this idea of something per year, that indicates that you're dealing with a pyramid of productivity. Your pyramid of numbers will be 1,000 individuals. The biomass is a certain mass per unit area. And your productivity, the unit of measurement, will have mass per area per unit time. It's usually kilos per hectare per year or grams per square meter per year. Those are the two most common that you'll see. Your pyramids of productivity always show this decrease along a food chain: 1575, 235, 25, and 3. Right? Again, that's due to the loss of energy through respiration and excretion at each of those levels. You may be tasked on an ESS exam or in one of your PSOWs to build a model of feeding relationships based on numerical data. On your ESS exam, it probably won't be this complex, probably wouldn't have this many species or as many different years. You should expect to have to do that at some point. Explain the transfer and transformation of energy as it moves through an ecosystem. Come back to thermodynamics when you do that. If you're asked to analyze the efficiency of energy transfers, okay, analyzing, you're looking for the pattern, you're going to calculate how efficient it is. So, what percentage of the biomass from producers is passed along to your primary consumers? What percentage of this biomass at your primary consumers is passed along to your secondary consumers? What percentage is passed along to the tertiary consumers? That's your efficiency. Construct a systems diagram of photosynthesis and respiration. Don't draw this. This is not a systems diagram. Stick with your boxes and your arrows. Show the outputs, show the inputs, the transfers, the transformations, and the storages. Right? Do not draw plants and animals. And again, this is very similar to what we just saw. Explain the relevance of the laws of thermodynamics, how energy is dissipated or lost as heat, which increases entropy as that energy and matter, as that biomass is passed along a food chain. The producer's ability to build glucose is a form of decreasing entropy. Right? It's actually increasing the organization. Explain the impact of a persistent or non-biodegradable pollutant. I suggest you focus on something that's well known, such as DDT or mercury. And you should be able to identify both the process of bioaccumulation within an individual organism over time and the biomagnification along a food chain within an ecosystem. That's it for today. That's topic 2.2, communities and ecosystems. If you found this video useful, please give it a like. Consider subscribing to my channel. You can also find other ESS resources at my website, mrcreamerscience.com.